Hello and welcome to the latest episode of YouMatter. Hello and welcome to this episode of YouMatter where I'm talking to Dave James. Dave was originally a nurse and then a podiatrist, owned his own business, podiatry business, but in more recent years works as a coach. Dave agreed to come and talk to me about the subject of anger. A brave ask, or brave response to agree to talk about anger, because as we talk about on the podcast, it's perhaps the top of the emotions that we consider unacceptable, something perhaps we shouldn't display, or if we do display it, then we don't shout about it and put it on our CV. Dave talks about his own personal experience of anger and how that became a go-to emotion for him, the impact of that in his life, largely his personal life, but also his professional life. We talk about ways to process and handle anger, but also we touch on anger in healthcare and whether it's acceptable in any way to have anger as part of your identity or your working practice as a healthcare professional. Really interesting topic, and Dave was very open and honest and human, didn't hold back in his responses, which I really appreciate, and I hope you'll enjoy the episode. I will be back at the end. So hello and welcome to the latest episode of YouMatter. As usual, I've forgotten what number episode it is, and I've given up pretending that I know what episode it is. I was going to say it's 20-something, it might even be 30. Anyway, welcome to the latest episode, where I am delighted to welcome Dave James, who is a podiatrist. Hi, Dave. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, I've just said to Dave that rather than some kind of official bio, I'd love to introduce him with the 4 things that he puts on the footer for all his LinkedIn posts, and I love these. So at the end of all Dave's posts on LinkedIn, it says, "Hi, I'm Dave. I help healthcare professionals to enjoy life, relationships, and business, coaching with real language and minimal cliches, because sometimes coaching language is a bit meh, really. I also probably write too much personal stuff in my posts." I always smile and chuckle when I read those. And I definitely identify with the last 2. The thing it doesn't say in there, David, is that you were once a podiatrist. Am I right in thinking you don't actually practice podiatry at all anymore?
No, I'm still registered with the. Every time I think I'm going to say HCPC, there's going to be little trumpets come out and angels make a noise. So I'm still registered with the HCPC, and I'll keep that going for a while. But I actually went this year. On my Royal College of Podiatry Insurance, I went non-practicing because I was only practicing 3 times a year anyway, and those 3 times were with homeless, so with a charity that I've been part of called Forgotten Feet. I haven't practiced clinically as a podiatrist full time since, get my dates right on this, January the 14th or 15th, 2019, and I know that's very precise. Just after I sold my business, so non-practicing.
And you are a coach.
Yes.
That's how I sort of came across you on LinkedIn. We've shared a few sort of moments where we agree on things, and we sort of liked lots of the same things, and we had a conversation. And then you very bravely, I think, have agreed to come and talk on this episode around the subject of anger. And the reason I say brave is not because I'm about to torture you with any hideous questions or try and expose things that you don't want me to expose, but I would say brave because my reflection is mostly that as human beings, and I would say particularly as health professionals, anger isn't something that we particularly feel we should be shouting about and putting on our profile on a really angry person, being super proud of it. It's a slightly touchy subject. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look at you having been a nurse before, registered with the NMC, I have to get this is going back in time and testing my memory. There's so much around this professionalism thing, which it's 24/7. You're a nurse, you're a podiatrist, you're a physio, you are that 24/7. And anything you do in your time outside of your clinical work, you're still judged by the same standards. So to talk about anger and to openly talk about it was certainly a big thing when I did start talking about it. It was kind of a very interesting place of vulnerability of, well, actually, if I say this, what's going to happen? What are people going to think of me? Am I suddenly going to be find that the HCPC strike me off? There was quite an interesting amount of a sort of fear and anxiety with that. Yeah, it's a very, very big thing.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about being vulnerable, which we do talk about and hear about a lot, you sort of get this idea of being sort of quietly admitting things that are a little bit uncomfortable, not saying, yeah, I'm a really angry person, or I've had issues with anger. Would you mind telling us a little bit of your story and your history with anger?
And what I will say actually is being vulnerable can be that small stuff as well.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't. I mean, I have a tendency, and this probably fits in with the anger. I have a tendency to be all the way over here and scared and fearful and meek little Dave, and I'm not a small bloke by any means. And then let's just go and kick the doors down and see what happens. There's very little grey area for me in some respects. So for me, sharing my story around anger, the first time I shared it openly was, apart from people close to me who knew about it, first time I shared about it was on stage. I actually went on stage and did a 6-minute speech about it. And my mum and dad were in the audience, which was quite a sort of a moment, but it was exactly the right thing to do at the right time. But to answer that question you just asked, so I've done a lot of thinking about this over the last few years. I very openly came out and talked about it in 2018, but I'm kind of in therapy at the moment, which is some of the best stuff I've ever done. Just having conversations with people, because we don't have many people around us necessarily. We can have these open conversations with in a non-judgmental way, and a therapist is absolutely fantastic for that. So I've been exploring where my anger stemmed from, and there's a couple of things. So I was born with spina bifida and a club foot. So I had quite a lot of hospital stuff up until sort of school age, and from school age onwards, 2 major operations prior to school. I wasn't particularly good physically at sports. I was always the one picked last at school. It's that kind of cheesy story everyone comes out with. I was picked last, and for football, and I was most of the time. And then when I was 14, so back in 1988, and this is one thing I speak about, and I'm speaking about tomorrow night, actually, at a Professional Speaking Association event. When I was 14, in the February of 1988, there was a classmate who was abducted and murdered. A young man called Stuart Goff, and this is in Hagley in Worcestershire, North Worcestershire. And that was one of those things which does change it changes the whole community. And the line I use when I speak is it flipped us all from being children to adults in one go, and the universe didn't even apologize for it. So I went very quickly from being a 6'2" child to being a 6'2" adult without any kind of preparation. And while there's a lot of stuff I don't really remember around that time, and I think there's a lot of stuff about my childhood I don't really remember. And that's not because I had a really shitty childhood. I had a really great childhood, but I just think there's things which don't really stand out for me then. But I know at that point, that's where my anger started to show. And I've got a very early memory of around that time of losing my temper over something. I don't know what it was. I have no idea what it was at all. I was at home with my parents, and almost coming out of this episode and finding that my bed was leaning against the wall. And I was like, I don't know how that got there. And that was quite worrying. And my parents are fantastic. I live 2 doors down from my parents. They are wonderful people. And there's a lot, and I'm jumping around a little bit here, but there's a lot of interesting stuff around trauma and how you integrate trauma. And integrating trauma with good parenting is one of those things, hugs and love and all that kind of stuff. But my parents were they kept very, very narrow in terms of their praise. They were not overly praising, and they were not underly praising, because they didn't know how I was going to respond. And so that anger would show up and really in frustration. And there's a lot for me around wanting to be heard and having a voice and being a teenager and all of the usual stuff which goes on. And 14 years old is that time when your brain's quite sort of pliable and bendy, and there's lots of lessons being learned. And so that anger just followed through, and it was never against people. And I'll say that now because there'll be some people watching this and listening to this going, yeah, I bet he beats people. And it never was. It never was. It was always about objects, doors in particular, for some unknown reason. But I would always lose my cool. I would go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in one moment, and things would get broken. That carried on probably throughout my teenage years, certainly. And then when I was 20, I had a friend who was at university, went to university. He'd started in the September of 93, my friend Ollie. And he went back to university in the January of 94. And that was on the Monday, on the Sunday. And then on the Friday, I got a phone call from a mate of mine to say he died. So suddenly in 1994, there's this thing lands where somebody else has gone. And this is someone I'm very close to. And 94 was a mess. It was a mess of a year in many, many ways. And that's where there was even more anger. And I talked to my dad about it. It was interesting when I chatted to my dad. He said, you're really unlucky. He said, you're really unlucky that those things happened to you. You've got being in hospital as a child, then you kind of take that on about, 7-8 years later, you've got what happened to Stuart, then 7-8 years later, you've got what happened to Wally, and it's just almost like the universe doesn't want to give you a break. But that anger kind of followed me right the way through all those usual adult relationships, university, jobs, etc., etc. But it was always in the background. And family knew about it, close friends knew about it. They were really supportive, which was great, but at the same time, they never challenged me on it. And that's that double-edged sword of, they're giving me space to basically be angry, but they're not actually turning around saying, actually, is there another way you could do that? And so it followed me through. But then there's times where it got worse. It got quite a lot worse in the birth of my children. And so I've got an 18-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 13-year-old now. And I said, when my daughter was born, the thing about children is that they don't kind of get to know you gently. They don't sort of show up and extend their hand and go, hi, I am. Let's have a relationship and let's be friends. They just literally jump in there, grab your heart, and that's it. And for me, it was just totally overwhelming. And I noticed that my tolerance was low, that my temper was worse, that I was angry, that I'd break things. And that was the first point where I actually engaged with CBT. And that was really useful and it really helped. Second child was easier. Third child was easier again. But there was always points where my tolerance would be low, and my response was 9 times out of 10 with me getting angry. And that was until 2015. And in 2015, my wife at the time, she basically had enough and said, right, I've had enough of you being angry, get out. And first of all, she left with the kids and the dog. And then my old man turned up on the doorstep and said, yeah, they're safe, but you've got to go. So I ended up leaving the house for 2 weeks. And that was the point where I went, okay, my behavior means that if I don't do something about this, I'm going to lose it all. And that was the point where I started to go down that, the cheesy personal development route and the journey, which we all have, and is probably the journey I'm on now, is why I do what I do now. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, I think.
Yeah,
I think it is. And you can kind of go in there surgically and unpick all of that.
Okay, I'll get my scalpel out. No, I mean, my main reflection, which I appreciate will be no news to you, but my main reflection is that at these times when you lost your 2 mates and also when your children came along, those are times of expected heightened emotion, not necessarily anger. Possibly people might assume that with the loss of your friends, perhaps it would be extreme upset, lots of crying, lots of that kind of emotion. And then when children come along, I remember this sort of rush of I don't know whether I would describe it as joy or whatever, but just rush of emotion. And what strikes me is that for you, it was always anger. And it could have been lots of other things, but it sounds like, who knows whether anger served you well in the first instance, and therefore you returned to, or it was just a habit that in your nervous system, every feeling gets translated as anger.
Yeah, because it could have been alcohol.
Yeah,
it could have been drugs. It could have been, promiscuous activity. It could have been anything else. It just so happened that mine was anger. And it's interesting that, looking back on it now, we're talking things which I'm 50 now. We're talking things which have happened over the last sort of 50 years, and I look at it now from a very different place. And it's taken me quite a bit of work to get to this place, because there's a huge amount of blame which goes with that, and frustration, and and not the compassion which I would I talk to people about and say, well, you offer compassion to yourself and others. It's like I didn't do that for the longest time to myself. But I look at the way in which I behave, and the way in which I behave is very much about distraction. And it's not surprising, really, that I'm trying to distract myself from the experiences of my past, and maybe even the experiences of my future. Certainly the last few years has getting very much out of here. So I can talk about this stuff from a headspace perfectly. It's things which happened from a memory. I can tell you the beats, but to feel it, that's a different thing. To take it to the heart and take it to the body and feel it. And that's been a lot of the work I've been doing over recent years. Is, well, what happens if I feel this? And I'm still not close to even being in a space where I can say I can feel this and feel like I feel like I'm in control of it, because I don't think you ever are. But to feel that I can actually hold on to this thing and I can work with it. It's as I said to a client of mine recently, all of my clients are awesome. They're amazing people who haven't yet recognized how good they are and how amazing they are. So I say to them, and I use my glasses case as an analogy, that I'm holding on to your awesome over here. And what I do is I pass it to you and you hold it for a bit. And you get a feel of it and you have a look at it and you check it out. And when you've kind of gone, oh, that's too much for me now, you hand it back to me. I'm still at the point where I'm kind of picking my emotion and my anger and my feelings up off the shelf and handling it for a bit, and then going, no, that's enough now. I'm just going to put it back over there, and I'm going to go off and do something else. And there's still behaviors which show up now in terms of distraction and work and things like that. I find that I make myself excessively busy and then get overwhelmed. The difference is now that whereas that overwhelm before would have led to me losing my shit and breaking something, now it doesn't. And it's actually it's a really nice place to be. It's actually really quite light and quite freeing. It's been a very interesting experience and a very interesting journey.
I want to talk to you about that nicer phase that you're in, but I just want to share, actually, Dave, the bit that I relate to in your story, which might surprise people, is the anger emotion coming out in relation to children and your glasses case analogy. So for me, I remember telling people afterwards, I never knew what depth of or heights of anger I could go to until I had children. And it was never at times where anger was the expected emotion. I totally relate to you that sometimes just the strength of emotion, anger was the outcome, which I never would have predicted, and I really hated. And there was also a point, actually, for me where I decided I wanted to try and pick this apart a little bit, and I worked with a psychotherapist. And this will make you smile, Dave. He asked me to create a process for myself. And my way of my process was, I said, okay, there's this sphere in front of me. It's like a bubble, and there are colors in it. And all the colors represent different emotions, and anger is really acid green. And I don't like it being in there. But my process is I'm going to intensify that color, and I'm actually going to allow more. It's like smoke. It's like I'm going to let more of this acid green smoke in there. And it was in this, really intense session, and he was just letting me go with it. And he said, what do you want to do with it? And I just mimed this process of getting this sphere and putting it inside my stomach and seeing if I could let it be there with all the other colors as well. And like you, actually, I use a version of that with clients, and whatever emotion it is we're trying to accept, I'll get them to describe the color and intensify it, and then see, just like you with your glasses case, can you put it inside you, and you get to decide how long you keep it there and when you let it out again. So really interesting that we both came to very similar sort of way to work with clients on it and for ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting how and there's no there's no right or wrong way to it. And I know one of the things about me speaking about anger, I thought that was, an end of career. It was like friends would just turn around and go, right, get out. We don't want anything to do with you. And it was taking the doors off the closet and exposing the skeletons to the world. And what happened, as happens with all of these things, is as soon as you turn around and say, this is what I've been going through, this has been my experience, a number of people turn up and go, thank you for that, because that's what we've been through as well. Or, that's the experience we've had. And actually, we thought we were alone. And the thoughts we shot, I mean, your story then about the depth of anger that you go to with children. I mean, working in A&E as a nurse, I've seen some horrendous things which have been done by parents to children. Absolutely horrendous. And we had training on, how to spot the signs of abuse of children and absolutely horrendous stuff. You have children of your own, and you get a very different perception or perspective on what it's like to be at 2:00 in the morning or even 2:00 in the afternoon and have a child which doesn't want to go to sleep and will not shut up or will not eat food, and you're pushed, you're sleep deprived, and you're pushed to the limit. And for a moment you go, I now understand why people cross that line. And it's scary, because you're like, I never thought that I could potentially be that person. It's just that you have that line there. There's a line there, and some people cross it, but it doesn't take much to cross it for some people.
No, sorry to talk over you then, Dave. I was just going to say I think it also has this weird close relationship with intense love, and that's confusing to have this being for which you never thought you could experience such intense love, and then this intense anger comes out with it, which is really crazy. I'm just wondering, with your story and the anger being in relation to the circumstances that you talked about, particularly with losing your friends, do you think if you had displayed extreme upset, that other people's process with you might have been different?
It's a really good question. Thinking back, and this is kind of speculation in the moment more than anything else. We're talking 1988. We're talking. I've got parents who probably wouldn't know how to deal with that anyway. What do you do? What do you do with a 14-year-old child who's been exposed to what's gone on? You don't. There's no rule book for parenting, and I think the biggest realization of me around parenting was realizing that my parents were still making it up now. And I thought they had it all sorted. I think it would have been hard to have really displayed that level of upset. And also, it's touching on some of the stuff we've talked about online before around men and boys and what they show in terms of emotion and what they display. Boys don't cry and all that kind of stuff. I don't cry. I mean, I cry on occasions. I cried at the end of the Avengers films in the cinema because that was properly sad. And I allow myself to feel a lot more than I ever did. But then, no, I wouldn't have done it. And it's interesting. One of the places I worked as well, I worked in a newsagent, and it was on a paper round that from the same newsagent I worked at where Stuart was abducted. And I remember there was in the newsagent, there was actually a petition to bring back the death penalty. And for the guy who did it, and I remember there was such anger at the time. It's like, did I sign it? Absolutely. Do I thinking about it now? Would I sign it again? Absolutely not, because now, it's a very different place. But it was more about that kind of anger response than anything else. I don't think breaking down, showing emotion, showing vulnerability, crying, it wouldn't have even been on my radar.
So interesting, because that was a loaded question for me. My assumption was you were going to go, if I'd been crying and upset, then people would have felt sorry for me and my parents would have talked that through with me and it would have been easier. And actually what I hear in your answer is actually anger was the more acceptable option.
Yeah. And also as well, I mean, I'm going to say that back then, I don't know whether there was any support offered. I don't remember there being this, let's offer counselling if it's available to any of the kids at the school. or to any of the parents in the village. And we're in a village then where the population at that point was something like 7,500. So people knew people, parents knew parents, parents knew kids, kids knew parents. It was very, very much a community. But I don't recall anything ever being offered. Now when something like that happens, there's some, and even things where it's comparative suffering. Who's to say that anything feels less or more of an emotional response? Where's the continuum? Where's the scale of what is worse than something else? Because it's a very subjective thing. But now there would be offers of counselling and therapy, and people will be brought into group stuff or singular stuff. Then absolutely nothing. And I think that would have made a huge difference to our experience, to have been able to talk about it. And it's interesting. I approached the school I was at the time, and Stuart was at, and I actually approached them earlier this year and said, "Look, this has been my experience. Do you want me to come in and have a conversation with the kids? Not just about that experience, but about the fact that things happen at school, and here I am X number of years later, and a fairly integrated member of society, not totally." But for other reasons as well, things around, being a bloke and working in healthcare and that kind of stuff as well. And I haven't heard anything back. I think I haven't heard anything back because they don't quite know what to do. They're like, well, actually, do we have this conversation, or do we just kind of gently brush it under the table? So even now, I think there's an element of what do we do with this?
Yeah, interesting. And you made brief reference, Dave, to what we were talking about before, and it's something that you followed, picked up on a thread of mine on LinkedIn. So for people listening, last week or the week before, I can't remember, I shared a Guardian article by Caitlin Moran. She's written a book. I can't remember the name of the book. I'll find it and put it in the notes. But the article was really interesting because Caitlin Moran is known to most people as being very funny, but also being a feminist. And she was very much taking on the mantle with this article of saying, hold my hands up, kind of have forgotten about men and boys. And she talked a lot about how it is being, particularly a boy growing into a man today. That was the gist of the article, and the sort of struggle with identity. And really, the article for me was around shining a light on boys thrashing around probably at the moment, trying to find out what they're supposed to be, what's acceptable, who it's okay to be in 2023 as a man or a boy. And you commented and picked up on that, and something clearly resonated. I asked you before we started recording today whether you thought these were two separate conversations or whether it related to anchoring. They were integrated. What was it about that article that made your ears prick up?
It's interesting. Being an ex-nurse, being a podiatrist, working in healthcare, as a bloke is interesting. You look at nursing statistics, and I'm from, these are what I've read. I don't know exactly whether they're right, but you take nursing, for example, 90% female, 10% male. And there's lots of conversations about what it's like to be a woman in the modern world. There's lots of focus on making or helping people to become more chief executives are female, and equality and equity and all those things. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. When I was 14, when I was a teenager, it was a very simple path. You were a boy. You did certain things in a certain way. When you became a man, you probably got married, had kids. You were likely to be the breadwinner, very much as parents had been and had been for many, many years. That all shifted very, very quickly. And it's like trying to build a house on sand. It's like, well, actually, what's the right thing to do now? Because everything seems to be wrong. But certainly going into healthcare, there seems to be a lot of conversations around how do you support women in environments which are male dominated, but there's not many conversations about how do you support men in industries and places where it's female dominated. Mm. And so I've got a friend, Andrew, who speaks quite a lot on men's mental health. I follow his stuff, and his stuff's really interesting, and he brings up these discussions, and he recommended a book to me, which is, I've got it over here, Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, which came out this year, which is a really fascinating read. And also earlier this year, no, it was late last year actually, for International Men's Day, I was asked if I would go and deliver a men's only mindfulness and meditation session at a local yoga place. And I went, yeah, absolutely. Not knowing what would come from it. And also feeling absolutely shit scared that because I was going to put my hand in the air and say, let's do something for men, that suddenly I was just going to be, cancelled and I was going to be in trouble because it's like, well, yeah, but what about the women? And it's like, hey, okay, fair enough. I think mindfulness and meditation helps everyone. I think my coaching and everything I do can help everyone. But in that moment, it was just, let's see what we can do with the blokes on their own. And it was fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating because all the blokes talked about the same kind of things. They talked about their fears and their worries. They talked about the stuff which they couldn't say openly. The majority of the room were white middle class. So, okay, we've got a very particular subset which is associated with, being a group of people who probably don't have to worry about too much, who were actually saying that they worry about things. And it was like, okay, so where do you go with this? What do you do with this information? And I've said I've got two boys, 15 and 13, and they are, in fact, we had a conversation the other day when they came down here and they were pulling out some vegetables in my garden and we were chatting about stuff and they were talking about Andrew Tate. Mm. And it's like, for me, I look at what Andrew Tate does and I'm like, I do not want to go and play in that arena. That for what he's talking about is just horrendous. I mean, you want misogyny, even a very, very gentle description of what it is. Andrew Tate appears in the dictionary. But they're 15 and 13 and they're being exposed to stuff. And if they haven't got good role models, and if they haven't got something which will make sense for them where they can go, okay, what's really going on here? They will pick on the thing which speaks to them. And I think Andrew Tate is from a marketing perspective, he's doing an amazing job of talking to young men and boys from a very powerful place. And that's quite scary. I'm going off on piste here a little bit, but there's been lots of things which have popped up for me where I've gone, okay, I need to look at this in a bit more detail. I need to understand why I feel the way about this, why I would feel guilt talking about it, why I would feel guilt, thinking about it. What do I say in conversations? What's right and what's wrong? There's so many kind of things popping up in my head. But one of the things which was really interesting, and it came from the Reeves book more than anything else, is we have all these conversations about let's help women. And I'm going to say at this point, we're talking kind of sex at this point, male and female. We're not talking genders, which is a whole other ballpark, and not to ignore the other genders which are out there, because that's even more complex. But something Reeves talked about in his book is that we spend all this time talking about how do we get females into the STEM professions, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but no one talking about how do we get men into the HEAL professions, so healthcare, education, administration, and learning. And it was interesting. I was at an event at a local college recently, at a Chamber of Commerce event, and I asked them a question. I said, how are you managing you're getting kind of men into these professions? Do you have anything specific which you work on with that? And they were like, not really. Okay, maybe that's a conversation to have. So I think there's been lots of little things which have popped up for me, and like most things, I'm going, I don't know where to start with this. I don't know what's the right thing to say, and I think there's a really good conversation to be had here, and I don't even know where to begin with it.
No, and you're so right about the fact that whole area is full of landmines, that it would be a brave person to just head out unprotected into that area. And I was just thoughtful actually while you were talking about healthcare, and you're absolutely right. It's a female-dominated profession, and yet there are numerous examples and stories of almost extreme pantomime misogyny within healthcare. I was thinking of the This Is Going to Hurt book and series, and some of the consultant character displayed there. And I know that you won't want to dismiss those scenarios which are real and awful for not just women actually, but more junior people in healthcare as well. But you're right, and when I posted that article, I put something at the top around, we seem to think that feminism is a zero-sum game where one side rises, the other has to naturally fall. And that seems to have been the game we've been playing with feminism more recently. And what I like about Caitlin Moran and modern feminists like her is that there's this conversation starting to arise of, okay, quite rightly, we have raised women up. Now, how do we integrate and make sure that we're also raising men and boys, and we're working out who we are together? The new man and woman, how do they integrate? Not how does one push the other down? Because both can be such better versions. And again, together, yin and yang, not trying to be the same, not trying to turn one into the other. I'm going on a rabbit hole there, but I've said before that as a woman in healthcare, and particularly as a physio, strangely, I've often felt a bit genderless. And partly the uniforms that we were put into when I qualified, trousers and tunics, really like horrible things. I remember once a comment stuck in my mind from a patient. It was in Australia, actually. I walked up to him and I said, "Oh, hi, I'm a physio." He went, "Yeah, of course you are. You've got short hair and a big bum." That's what physios look like. And whilst that was a fairly unpleasant comment, I was like, that's an interesting reflection. And I was always a bit of a tomboy and happy to have lots of male friends and happy to sort of play in that sort of arena. But I am also quite aware that, strangely, in healthcare, I didn't feel that being overly feminine was particularly welcome. And I wonder if that is that I'm exactly the same age as you, Dave, and grew up with the sort of rise of the feminist message of you can have it all, and thinking, oh God, how do I deal with having it all? And does that mean I have to behave like the boys and like a man? It's all very confusing, isn't it?
Oh, it's hugely confusing, and I know there's been a huge amount of guilt even thinking about this stuff. It's like I'm waiting for Tom Cruise to turn up and shoot me. But a bit like Minority Report, or I'm having these thoughts about stuff, someone's going to find out there's something going on. That was a bit like with the anger. I'm having all this anger. If anyone finds out, that's it. But I know that as a white middle class guy with no particular money issues and living in a place which is nice and not seeing stuff. I mean, I've seen stuff as an A&E nurse and as a healthcare professional, huge kinds of stuff. Doesn't mean I have lived experience of it, but I'm aware of it. There's so much I don't know. And the challenge now is when you speak up on something, or you have a thought about something and say something about it, there's somebody out there who turns around and says, well, you've got no experience of that, so you can't have a view on it. I mean, I've never flown a helicopter, but I can imagine it's hard work. What I'm always up for, I think this is a skill which school needs to have. It's there's discernment, there's critical thinking, and there's the ability to have a conversation on a thing, not about the person, not about undermining someone else. There's so much in conversation here that I would love to have, because I don't know what the answer is. I know that I'm speaking from a place of pretty decent relative privilege. I joked with and I don't think it is actually a joke, really. I joked with my two lads that they may well become a marginalised group in the future. And that's going to be very interesting. They're going to have whatever I have to navigate now, they're going to have to navigate a huge amount. But there's so many conversations to open up here about the experience of what it's like to be a particular sex or gender in a particular location. And I still remember as a student nurse, I can't remember, it was on the vascular surgery ward at Dudley Road Hospital in Birmingham. Me being a 6-foot+ student nurse with long hair at the time, which is quite hard to believe, with a very petite female nurse. And the person we were talking to turned around to me and thought I was the senior nurse and started talking to me. And I went, no, she's in charge. I'm the student nurse. You need to have that conversation. But I'll openly admit that there have been times as a podiatrist when I've been there wearing a shirt as a Band 7 team leader with some other podiatrists who are probably more qualified than me. And have I abused that position that they think that I've got more power? Yeah, absolutely, because it's got them to do what's needed to be done. It's finding that balance as to what do you talk about, what do you say, how do you approach it, and also you talk about the zero sum game, that for this person to win, this person has to lose. Well, what about if this person can win and this person can win? And there's so much kind of banging around my head at the moment. I could just blah, and we'll make no sense of it. So
that's all right. I don't mind if you want to do more of that.
It could be 3 hours later.
Yeah, a half-day podcast. No, well, definitely something I'm happy to return to. And like you, I sort of, I have a son and a daughter, and they are exploring this modern world in various ways, both of them, to a greater or lesser extent. But my son has actually said the same, that he sometimes feels like he's being pushed into a marginalized area, but also recognizes his extreme privilege. It's a strange situation.
It's tough actually, and I was chatting to a friend of mine he's a hypnotherapist by trade, but he's much more than that. He properly fixes people's heads, and he put a post up, I think it was on Facebook, where he was saying that he was really quite worried because the conversations he was having with younger men about how they feel they couldn't go and have conversations with females because they were so scared of what might happen. Excuse me. And they were so scared of, they might go up and say, hi, how you doing? And then get accused of something. And it was this genuine sort of shit. Are we at that point where people can't have a conversation because they're scared that they're going to get accused of an ulterior motive or doing something? And I think about it in context of, and it may well have changed now, and I'd be happy to be corrected, as a male nurse, and certainly towards the latter end of my career, and as a male podiatrist, there were always times where you'd go in and say, okay, I'm a male podiatrist, you're a female patient, do you need a chaperone? I don't ever remember it being the other way around. I don't ever remember being a male patient and having a female come in and say, we've got to do this, do you need a chaperone? It was always assumed that a chaperone was required when it was a male practitioner and a female patient. And that, I look at that now and think that's, okay, I get it. I get it that there must be statistics out there which mean that needs to be done. But I think, like most of healthcare and most of the health service, it's not about doing things to protect people. It's about doing things to tick boxes. It's about, a thought popped into my head now. My dad has he's getting his blood pressure monitored. He's on beta blockers and various other drugs, and they've sent him through a form which he needs to complete and then send back in to show readings twice. It's 2 readings twice a day for his blood pressure. And I'm going, okay, well, what's going to change with that? They're not doing it because they're worried about your blood pressure. They're doing it because they're worried that if they don't do it, they'll lose funding, or they're not going down the governance route, and there'll be some problems. And it just becomes this layer upon layer of stuff about, are we doing things really because it makes a difference, or are we doing things because we have to look like we're doing things? But that's a whole other discussion. That's podcast number 12 of us. Yeah.
112. It's interesting that the thing about you asking if you hear what you were hinting at, that if you're a female going in to treat a male, should we be asking them for a chaperone? I've been watching Bad Sisters on Apple Plus, which I don't know if you've seen it, but the premise is of these 5 Irish sisters, and one of them is married to an absolutely hideous bloke, and he's displayed in a really explicit way that he's a deeply unpleasant person. And the premise of the series is these sisters trying various ways to bump this brother-in-law off. And it's very funny, it's very well done, and I'm sure there's a big twist coming at the end. Lots of people would have seen it. I'm not going to give a spoiler because I haven't got to the end. But my husband just quietly said at the end, I wonder if anyone would be brave enough to make a series where 5 men kill their sister-in-law. And uncomfortable moment, I think he's right. I think that would be probably not there yet. Right, let's bring it back.
yeah. Let's reel Dave back in. Come on.
No, and me too. And the trouble is, I can happily go there with anybody that wants to go down any rabbit hole. I'll reel us both back. I said I wanted to talk to you about sort of the the next phase for you with anger? Because it sounds like, I hear you're still in therapy, you're still working with it, but what's changed for you around anger?
It's interesting that when I speak about this, I've got a showcase I do for Professional Speaking Association, and I talk about the one thing which changed everything. And I think the one thing which changed everything for me was finding a space between whatever was going on in the world and me being angry and me responding by breaking things. And so if you ever read the book Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about between stimulus and response, there's a gap. Now, when I spoke about this on stage in 2018, I talked about that, but I'd never read Man's Search for Meaning, and I started talking about this stimulus and response as a gap, and then went back and thought, God, have I been channeling Viktor Frankl by mistake and not going it's his work, not mine? But it was this realization of going, right, there's something where I'm responding to something in anger. Now, I would have said there's something that is making me angry, but I know now that's not the truth. It's like no one can make you feel anything without your permission. There are things out there which will put you into a place where your response is likely to be anger, but on the whole, you choose how you want to respond. So slowing things down, mindfulness was huge, meditation was huge, being aware of my internal state, but also having an awareness of what was going on in my world. So I have an element of OCD which pops up occasionally, particularly on checking doors and checking security. And I know this goes right the way back to childhood and my dad leaving doors open and things like that, front door and stuff like that. So I know when my OCD starts to play up, or I spend a bit more time checking the door, it's like that's the cue for me to go, okay, what's going on here? Is there too much going on? Is there too much stress? Have I taken on too much? Am I overwhelmed? Which is a perpetual state for me anyway, which is part of the fun of being me. But now I recognize it and I go, okay, there's something going on here. I can give myself a bit of space. And I give myself permission to do less, or I give myself permission just to kind of shut the world out, or go and stick the PlayStation on, or go out for a walk, or go and have a coffee somewhere, or go and sit and read a book. Whereas before I wouldn't have done that. So there's a huge element for me in the space. You're finding this space between stimulus and response. And I've been through the disassociation process, which I think a lot of people do with mindfulness, which is, I don't feel anger. Anger is not an emotion which pops up on my lexicon and menu of emotions. And I realized how shitty that was, because then it meant I was feeling nothing. Because anger is purely an emotion. It's what you choose to do with it. So now I find a lot of amusement in it, and I play games. I play games with it, and I do this with clients. So I had a client who we were talking about road rage. So I get this really, really bad road rage. I said, okay, well, first of all, thank you for acknowledging that. Secondly, what do you think it is which causes the road rage? And I've had that. I've had road rage in the past where someone overtakes me. How dare they? I must hunt you down, and I must find your firstborn, and I must make them pay. And it becomes like this Klingon ritual of death almost. Whereas now I'll kind of say, okay, have a think about where this comes from. What else is going on with your life which has reduced your tolerance level? So you're going to take it out on some random stranger. They're dehumanized and depersonalized because you don't know their name. And you don't know what's going on in their world. You're kind of intersection with them at this point where it's like, this is where I am and this is where they are. But I've got no idea what's going on for that. So I play games. It's like, give them a name, John or Jane or whatever name you want to give them. And then make up a story about why they might be doing that thing. So it could be that John has cut you up because he's in a real hurry to get to a shop before it closes. Now, this shop is actually selling him his dress because he's going on stage tonight to do his first ever drag show. So at the moment, that's his focus. And he's really worried about that because it's the first time that he's worn a dress on stage. And he's worried that he's not going to be able to get heels to fit him because he's got quite big feet. And I'll say this to people and they'll start laughing. And it's like, well, that could be just as true as the fact that in the moment where you get road rage, you think that they have got some personal vendetta against you. And suddenly it just becomes quite a light thing where you realize that actually most of the things which you think are focused on you, and people are doing things to annoy you, and people are doing things because they don't like you, they've got absolutely nothing to do with you at all. You're just spending the time making them about you. So for me, there's a huge amount of lightness in that. It's my eldest lad. I separated from my wife during COVID, which has been a huge thing in terms of identity. And who am I at 50 and single? It's like, I have no idea, because the whole dating world has changed, and it's like, do I talk to anyone? I don't know. What am I? Am I really that sexuality I thought I was all those years? I don't know. There's just so much there. But I was talking to him, and he had a really good observation, which was, he said, you seem more relaxed. He said, you don't worry about things. And I said to him, look, I do worry. I said, I am a worrier right at my core. I said, I just realize now that I have less that I need to worry about, because I can't control half of it. I can't control 95% of it. So I control and I worry about a very, very small subset of what I could. And that was really interesting, having that conversation with him about what he'd noticed. And there's a real lightness which comes with that. It's really quite fun. And the other thing about, going through the separation a couple of years ago is that the version of Dave who, if I'd have separated in 2014, 2015, it would have been a mess. It may well be a mess now, and I just haven't noticed because I'm just ignoring half of it, but it would have been a very, very different outcome. Now I look at it and I go, I don't like that. I don't like what's happened. But actually, I know that if I look back on this in 4 or 5 years' time, I'll look at it and go, that was a pivotal moment, and it led to this, 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 and this. And that's quite a freeing thing, is to look at it and go, okay, I can think about this in a very different way.
Is it true to say that if you had separated in 2014, 2015, it would have been about your anger?
Yeah, absolutely. And it may well be that the separation in 2020 is still about my anger. Lots of conversations came out of that, which is really interesting, particularly around, I don't think I've ever talked about this actually openly, but I'm going to, because it's fine to talk about it. Conversations I had around with my ex in particular, around, she said that she behaved in a particular way around me to avoid me getting angry. So there's huge questions in identity around there about, well, I think everything's okay, I'm getting angry, and then I withdraw for a period of time because I'm scared of getting angry again. And then actually everything seems to integrate, and I think, oh, everything's okay now. But actually it's not, because the other person is behaving in a particular way to avoid that response. And I totally get that. I mean, I'm 6'2", my ex is 5'2". And while not a meek individual by any means, she was doing everything she could to protect her and protect the kids. And if that means behaving in a particular way to avoid an outcome, and it didn't avoid an outcome, but it means that you're having a conversation with somebody you don't truly know. Mm. So yeah, it could be that the separation now is still down to that. I don't know. It's a really hard one to unpick, and half of this stuff will only come out in the wash in a few years' time. But I'm cool with the fact that it's always a bit cheesy that everything happens for a reason. That's very kind of just sit back and let the universe do its stuff. But actually, the way I view this and the way I package it and the way I kind of interpret it can be either for something fantastic, freedom and opportunity and bravery and curiosity, or it can be inconvenience and a pain in the arse and hatred and anger. It can be whatever I want it to be. And it's not to say that there aren't still some times where I sit there and go, I really don't like this, and I don't understand this. And that's part of the therapy process as well. But it's that reframing which has made a huge difference.
Mm. I'm just thoughtful about, in a long marriage, people change. And yet you're right, there are significant moments where identities and thoughts about yourself and the other person are embedded. And who's to say that it's even reasonable to expect two people in a marriage to be able to make that shift and stay together, even if things have changed for the better, because there is so much in the marriage, in the nervous system of those two people. They're deeply embedded, isn't there?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge, and it comes down to identity again. The version of me a few years ago never thought that there would be a marriage which would be anything other than a marriage. Mm. Whereas I look at it now and go, okay, not exactly where I'd want to be, but at the same time, it's like, actually, it makes perfect sense. You know, we live longer than we ever have in the past, and maybe that may not continue in generations to come. We'll have to see with the amount of diabetes and heart disease out there. But is it a reasonable expectation to believe that you would be with somebody and you'd be with someone throughout your entire life? I don't know, and that's where the identity questions come into it. What reference point do I have? My parents, who've been married what seems to be an eternity. But do we do things the way that they've done things? Very different world. So yeah, there's so much in this. God, it's just like, how long you got? Yeah, I'll get the kettle on. Let's carry on talking.
Well, I do love your two reflections on anger, and I think if people are, curious about their own anger or anger of people they live with, work with, those two things you said, creating that gap between stimulus and response, which, I think when we have phrases like the red mist came down, there's this temptation to think that there is no space. And I've used it as an excuse myself. Like, I couldn't have helped that. I was angry before I knew it. There was no point at which I could have stopped that cascade. And to an extent, I think that's true. But I think what you alluded to, and which I can really agree with, is that it's more about the preparation. So accepting that actually, yes, for most of us, whether it's tipping into anger or depression or anxiety or whatever, if you think of a graph, there's probably a bit where we start to go down a narrow slope. And then for most of these situations, there's a big drop off. And yet at that point, asking someone to employ one of our lovely coaching tools or do a bit of mindfulness is probably not going to get them back at that slope.
Yeah.
But if we're honest, there is work most of us can do earlier on in that slight downward phase. You said for you, it's when your OCD kicks in. I've shared on many podcasts in conversations that for me, when I start trying to fix every single person in my life, I know that I'm in that overwhelmed state and I'm doing too much. That's a trigger for me to go, okay, you're about to flip into something less acceptable than just fixing people. So let's just sort this out a little bit. So I think what I hear there is, that there is something we can do in that gap between stimulus and response. It may not be actually in that moment, but there's stuff we can do to try and lessen the likelihood that we're going to keep plummeting down that deep gradient. And then I absolutely love your story of creating quirky, slightly amusing stories about other people, maybe deeply emotive stories about other people to make us humanize them, as you say. I think those are two really, really helpful techniques.
I think you have to have fun with it. If you ever look at the work around creating a memory palace and memorizing a deck of cards, or those kind of things, they talk about memories as basically being quite graphical and often rude, and those are the way which you remember things, and that plays very beautifully into my A&E days of very kind of dodgy humor in order to cope with whatever you're dealing with. So I've got an analogy which might work. I've just been thinking about this while you were talking, that I like car analogies. I always like a car analogy. So the version of me before we're getting angry was that I would jump in the car, park on the drive, I would slam the accelerator down to the ground in gear, I would drive across the lawn and across the lovely flower beds and then smack straight into a wall. And I would say, I don't know what happened. The car just did it. It was nothing to do with me. Now, I get in the car, I let the handbrake down, I put it into gear, I drive, not at a very fast pace. I drive across the drive, over the lawn, over the beautiful flowers, and then I might drive into the wall. The difference now is I can actually spot each of those actions. So it might be that there's a point where I go, I'm not even going to let the handbrake off because I know where this is going. I'm going to actually get back out the car. I'm going to walk. I'm going to have a bit of fresh air. I'm going to go and do something different. There might be times where the handbrake's off, it's in gear, I've put the accelerator down, and I'm already on the flower bed. But then I've hit the brakes, and I haven't gone into the wall. And then the only job is to turn around and go, yeah, okay, I went further than I'd want to, but I didn't go into the wall. And then have the conversation about why that might have happened. And I'm thinking about, the times where I would get quite grumpy with the kids, and they would get a, quite an angry response from me. And last year when I was away with my boys for a couple of days in London, and my youngest was struggling. He was struggling with it being quite busy in London, and I probably struggle with it being quite busy in London as well. Plus, I've got these two lads who I'm taking around with me, and I know that my kind of tolerance was quite low, and I was quite grumpy with him in a restaurant, and there were tears and all kinds of stuff. And I remember saying to him after something, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to take it that far, and this is why I did it. And it was actually the opportunity to have a conversation around it. The other side to that was it was me going and having a conversation with me and going, you're not a failure as a dad. You're doing something which is actually for many people is perfectly natural, but you've actually opened up and had that conversation, because it's very easy for me in the past to turn around and go, you were a shit dad.
Yes.
You shouldn't have done that. That just shows what you're like. And there's always a fear of, what if I go back to being that angry person that I was before? And the reality is that angry person is still there. That doesn't change. If we use a Hulk analogy, Bruce Banner doesn't stop being the Hulk because the Hulk doesn't show up. The Hulk's still there. It's that conversation you have, and it's where you take it.
And if that comes out in some way, there's there's more work to do with yourself after the event as well, around being compassionate rather than berating yourself.
There's always work to do.
There's always work to do.
Damn it.
So final question, Dave, and bringing it back to healthcare.
Okay.
Because you actually brings it right back to the start. You talked about professional identity, and almost, I don't think you actually said this, but I got the impression you're saying almost there's this persona that you have to keep up all the time as a health professional, and maybe in our own heads all the time, and not even with patients. So is there any scenario, or does anger have any place within the health in healthcare? Is it ever acceptable to display any modicum of anger as a health? It's a nice, easy question to finish with.
Yeah. So we got this. This is the half-hour answer, isn't it? See, anger is just one word to describe a state. And if you look at there's a great cushion which my therapist has actually, which she gets me to hold occasionally, but on it has got different words for different states, and there's about 6 different states, and then you've got different, and it's split, so it's like 6 different states. Each state will go into like 3 different areas, and each of those 3 areas will maybe have about 5 different words. And anger is just one of those things. I would say that anger and frustration can be pretty close. Tiredness, there's all these things which we'll kind of look into it. I think it's understanding the cause behind it. Is it ever acceptable to be angry at work? I mean, the gut reaction is no. Was I ever angry at work? No. Was I ever frustrated at work? Yes. Did I ever say anything which might have pushed things a little bit? Absolutely. Did I ever witness a friend of mine in A&E berate somebody and basically force them out to the waiting room because they, as a patient, they were being a pain in the backside? Absolutely. There's times where your frustration comes out, and there's times where you're allowed to be frustrated, and there's times where actually airing that frustration and saying what's on your mind will really help a relationship. I think sometimes in healthcare we're taught that actually we shouldn't do that we should basically suck all of this up because the patient is the most important person. I'm not saying they're not important, but it's a relationship which goes in both directions. And sometimes the relationship with the patient is not best served by holding your tongue. Sometimes you do actually need to turn around and say exactly what you're thinking and feeling. Should that be displayed as anger? My gut would be no. But should it be displayed as a compassion? And compassion in this sense being, hey, look, I love you as a human being. I appreciate you've got things going on with your life, and there's a lot which isn't your fault, but you're being a dick. And being able to say that to people and hold them accountable for their actions. And that's where I think healthcare has probably slipped into a place of the customer always being right. And actually, who are the experts in the room about all the knowledge and information? That with the healthcare person. Who's the expert about living with that condition? Well, unless the healthcare person's got it, it's going to be the patient. So actually being able to open up and speak to people in a way which is human and honest and collaborative would make a huge difference. And probably that would reduce the amount of frustration that healthcare professionals have as well, because they're able to say what they need to say.
Brilliant answer. Well navigated and very humanly and honestly navigated, which I would say has been you throughout this podcast episode. Thanks, Dave.
I mean, I've dodged answers to questions. That's
not at all. Thank you. That's what I appreciate.
No, it's fine. No, it's been lovely. Thank you so much. I love being able to think about these things, and it's very different talking about it in this way and having questions than me sitting here and bouncing stuff about my head, where the only viewpoint I've got is Dave's viewpoint, which is not often wrong, but it's also at times needs some external stuff. So yeah, that's been really useful. Thank you.
People will have really enjoyed listening to you, and a lot of people will have found a lot they can relate to and a lot of helpful thoughts and insights. So Dave, if people wanted to learn more about you and your work, what are the best ways to find you, get hold of you?
So I have a website, which is that's my email. hello@davethecoach.co.uk is my email. It's always the most difficult question, this one, isn't it? So hello@davethecoach.co.uk.
What was it?
.co.uk.
.co.uk. Yeah.
And then my website is davethecoach.co.uk. So you can contact me via any of those. I tend to play on social media. I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and we can say at this point when this goes out, Threads, because FOMO and all of that. Although I'm not even, I've just deleted off my phone. I can't even be asked with it. And Facebook, but the place I play most of all is LinkedIn. That's where I post most days. That's where I have most of my interactions. And that's because it works for me, I think, better as a business. It's hanging around the people who I want to work with, whereas other places tend not to do the same. So yeah, and possibly on a stage near you, if you're at a conference, I might be speaking at that conference. And if you're a conference organizer and you're looking for someone to speak on these things, then I'm always happy to have a conversation.
There you go. Nicely done.
Boom.
They can see your face if they're not watching the video. Thank you, Dave. I will continue to follow your posts on LinkedIn because I love them. I love the fact that you always make me chuckle as well as write interesting and intelligent things. So I will continue to do that. And thank you so much for being the guest today.
Oh, thank you, Joe. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Listening. If you enjoyed listening to that episode, I hope that if any of it rang true for you or made you think about people that you are in relationships with or work with or are friends with, I hope that there were things that gave you food for thought and perhaps some ideas for ways to help and how to move forward. It's a topic that I would be really interested to hear your responses on. I don't think there are many conversations going on around anger in health professionals. I'd be really interested to know your reflections. I would also really appreciate if you're enjoying the YouMatter podcast and you're able to give a review, particularly on YouTube. If you can give a rating, it helps to boost YouMatter up the podcast charts and make sure that it's available to more people. So take care. If you are a health professional, being all things to all people in all spheres of your life, if you occasionally experience anger and that brings up feelings for you, then maybe reflect on the things Dave and I were talking about today. Maybe see if there's some compassion you can find for yourself around anger, other people. Maybe some reframes that you can bring about, maybe some of Dave's quirky, funny stories. But ultimately, breathe, give yourself a break. Remember that you matter.